It was the kind of morning that made you believe everything was under control. The Arizona sun hadn't yet turned cruel. The air outside still held a hint of cool desert calm, and the hum of sprinklers echoed down the long row of stucco offices that made up Desert Trail's business complex. Inside Suite 2B, Mark sat at his desk with a cup of burnt coffee, staring out at the parking lot that never quite filled up. His world was small but steady. Consulting work, a few regular clients, a plant in the corner that refused to die, and the occasional gossip shared with the janitor about the flickering hallway light that management had promised to fix 6 months ago. For a retired Air Force man turned small business consultant, Mark liked things simple. He didn't need excitement anymore. His idea of a good day was finishing his invoices early and hearing the faint buzz of someone mowing the grass outside. He liked the smell of the cheap coffee from the lobby machine, the clack of his old keyboard, and the way the building's AC unit rattled right before it decided to behave. Predictable, peaceful. That's how life had been until Karen showed up. She arrived one Tuesday just before noon. Mark remembered because the copier had jammed again, and he was elbow-deep in toner when he heard heels clicking across the lobby tile like a metronome of impending irritation. "Good afternoon," she announced to nobody in particular, voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the vending machine. She introduced herself to the receptionist first, then made her rounds through the halls like a new sheriff in town. When she finally got to Mark's door, she leaned in, bright smile plastered across her face. "Hi, I'm Karen Nichols, the new HOA president, and also the building's operations manager." Mark nodded politely. "Nice to meet you. I'm Mark. Been here about 3 years. "Oh, wonderful," she said, looking around his small office like she was evaluating a used car. "We're implementing new standards to keep everything orderly. You'll be getting some notices soon, just informational." That word, informational, would come to haunt him. At first, he didn't think much of her. Every building had someone like that, a person who thought laminated rules were a personality. But a few days later, he noticed new signs taped to the walls. Community lobby use restricted to HOA members. Another one read, "No unapproved beverages in shared areas." There were so many signs it looked like the hallway had broken out in red tape. Still, Mark minded his business. He wasn't about to pick a fight over coffee cups. He had a meeting that Thursday morning with 2 clients, a retired couple planning their small business taxes. The conference room's AC was on strike again, so he figured the lobby, bathed in morning light and freshly vacuumed, would do just fine. He set up at one of the small tables, laid out folders, poured some coffee from his thermos, and got to work. 10 minutes later came the unmistakable click of heels. Karen, clipboard in hand, eyes locked. "Excuse me," she said, each syllable polished and cold. "This area is for HOA authorized use only." Mark blinked. "I'm an HOA member. I rent Suite 2B. Tenants," she corrected, "are not authorized representatives. Only the board may use communal space for official business meetings. You'll need to vacate immediately." He tried not to laugh. "I'm not holding an official meeting, just talking taxes with a couple clients." Karen looked at his thermos as though it were contraband. "Unapproved beverage container. That's another infraction." The clients stared at her, half amused, half uncomfortable. Mark sighed, gathered his papers, and said gently, "All right, Karen, we'll move to my office." She smiled, victorious, and walked away, probably to file the world's most pointless report. Mark could have been angry, but honestly, it was too ridiculous to take seriously. Until the next day. When he arrived that morning, an envelope was taped to his door. Desert Trail's HOA notice of infraction. In Comic Sans, no less. He opened it and nearly spat out his coffee. Unauthorized use of common area. $75 fine. It even came with a photo of him in the lobby, clearly taken from the security camera above the coffee station. Below it, in bold letters, "Repeat violations may result in lease termination or removal from the premises." He laughed so hard he had to sit down. "Who writes this stuff?" he muttered. He assumed it was some weird initiation ritual. Maybe she was trying to make an impression. But then the emails started. One about door decal compliance. Another about proper paper disposal etiquette. Then the masterpiece, noise complaint, excessive printer activity after 5 p.m. Mark began to suspect that Karen wasn't just a little controlling. She was on a mission. A mission to make everyone miserable in the name of community harmony. The other tenants whispered about her. The accountant down the hall said she'd measured his welcome mat to make sure it was within aesthetic parameters. The dentist on the corner claimed she'd reported him for unauthorized toothpaste promotion signage. Mark handled it the same way he handled most nonsense, with patience and mild sarcasm. When she sent an email titled urgent, misaligned parking incident, he replied with a photo of his car perfectly centered between two faded white lines and wrote, "I'll alert NASA." But it was the third week when things truly crossed from silly to surreal. He just finished a call and was heading out to meet a client when Karen intercepted him in the lobby. Clipboard ready. Smile locked. "Mr. Collins," she began, voice dripping with manufactured authority. "Due to your repeated noncompliance, I'm afraid we'll have to terminate your access to common areas effective immediately." Mark frowned. "Terminate? What are you talking about? You've violated multiple provisions. Unauthorized meetings, improper signage, beverage infractions." She ticked them off like crimes against humanity. "I'm afraid you're dismissed." He chuckled. "Dismissed? Karen, I don't work for you." She blinked, thrown off for just a second, then recovered. "Nevertheless, I'm ordering your removal from the premises." "Removal?" he repeated, glancing around. There was no security guard, no property manager, just two stunned realtors pretending to look busy while secretly watching the drama unfold. She pulled out her phone like a badge. "I'll be calling security now." He tilted his head. "Karen, there is no security." "Then I'll call the HOA office," she snapped. "Which is you." That one caught her off guard. For a second, her mouth opened and closed like a goldfish trying to find a rulebook underwater. Then she huffed, spun around, and stomped off, muttering something about insubordination. The realtors snickered. Mark gave a small bow and went on his way, but inside he was fuming. Not because of the embarrassment, he could handle that, but because it was so unnecessary. He paid rent on time, kept his space tidy, and treated everyone with respect. But Karen? She needed to be in charge of something, even if she had to invent it. That evening, sitting on his porch with a cold beer and the hum of cicadas, he replayed the whole scene. The absurdity of it all. Being fired from a building he wasn't employed by. He could complain to the actual property manager, but they were out of state and barely answered emails. He could ignore her, but she'd just escalate. No, this called for something quieter, smarter. He wasn't angry anymore, just curious. Curious how far someone like her would go if nobody stopped her. Curious how the system she weaponized might turn against her with just a little push. He smiled then, slow and deliberate, the way only a man who's spent years in the military and decades in business can smile when he's already 3 steps ahead. The sound of sprinklers clicked on across the street. He raised his bottle in a silent toast. "That letter changed everything," he said softly, watching the mist catch the light. And just like that, the game had begun. The next few weeks felt like a slow unraveling of sanity wrapped in polite suburban absurdity. Every day brought a new email, a new rule, or a new reason for Karen to stand in the lobby like she was waiting for the royal motorcade. It was as if she'd made it her personal mission to turn a quiet office complex into a bureaucratic circus. Mark tried to laugh it off at first. After all, there were bigger problems in the world than a self-appointed office monarch with a clipboard addiction. But by week 2, even he had to admit this woman was on a crusade. The first email came with the subject line, "Immediate attention required. Flag sticker, non-compliance." He opened it while sipping coffee, expecting maybe a notice about rent or maintenance. Instead, he was informed that the small American flag decal on his office door violated the Uniform Visual Presentation Policy. He read it twice, then looked at the little sticker, 3 inches wide, peeling slightly at one corner, something he'd bought at a gas station years ago. Uniform presentation, he muttered. What is this, the Pentagon? He wrote back, noted. I'll ensure my patriotism is up to code. The next day, another email arrived. Unauthorized coffee aroma detected in hallway. Apparently, someone had reported the smell of brewed coffee escaping his office. He wasn't sure which was worse, that she had someone sniffing around or that she'd actually typed that phrase. He replied simply, I'll switch to decaf if that helps the HOA's olfactory balance. By the third week, he stopped being surprised by the nonsense and started documenting it. Screenshots, letters, even the timestamps. He began to suspect this wasn't about policy at all. It was about power. Other tenants started whispering, too. The accountant next door, a nervous guy named Brian, confessed one morning that Karen had left a note under his windshield wiper for angled parking. The note included a photo of his car, slightly crooked, along with the line, You represent our community's image. The dentist down the hall wasn't spared either. He'd put up a small cardboard sign near his door reading, Smile. You're in good hands. Harmless. Friendly. Karen had it removed, citing visual clutter and non-standard typography. She actually said, typography, the dentist grumbled. I didn't even know she knew that word. Mark listened, nodding. She's building a resume in tyranny, he said dryly. It would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. The entire office complex began to feel like an experiment in patience. People whispered in hallways, avoided eye contact near the bulletin board, and spoke in lowered voices as if noise might summon her. But Karen didn't just rely on written notices. She had a flair for public enforcement. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind where the copier jammed and the vending machine swallowed dollars. Mark was in the lobby again, chatting with a client named Gary, when Karen descended from her office like a hawk spotting prey. Clipboard in hand, phone tucked under her arm, expression already set to authority. Mr. Collins, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You are in violation of multiple property guidelines. Mark turned slowly, coffee in hand. Good morning to you too, Karen. This is not a joke, she said, pointing her pen like a sword. You've hosted unauthorized meetings in common spaces, displayed unapproved decor, and violated our beverage policy. Our what now? The beverage policy, she repeated, as if saying it twice made it real. Open liquids are not allowed near communal furniture. You've been warned. Gary, the client, stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or apologize. Mark set his cup down carefully. Karen, you can't just invent rules. She scoffed. As acting operations manager and HOA president, I have full jurisdiction. Over tenants? Over everyone, she said, eyes narrowing. The absurdity of it all hit him at once. So, you're firing me? He asked with mock seriousness. Karen nodded sharply. Yes. I am terminating your use of this property effective immediately. Mark blinked. Karen, I rent this office. I'm not your employee. Her voice went up a notch. Then I'm revoking your lease privileges. You'll vacate immediately or I'll call security. There was no security. There hadn't been since 2019 when the last company cut costs and left. But that didn't stop her. She stormed off, phone in hand, muttering, This is insubordination. Absolute insubordination. Gary leaned in and whispered, Is this normal? Apparently it is now, Mark said. 5 minutes later, Karen reappeared with a maintenance worker in tow, a confused 20-something holding a mop. Escort him out, she ordered. The poor guy blinked. Ma'am, I just cleaned the floors. Then clean this situation up, she snapped. Mark nearly laughed. He gathered his folder, nodded to the kid, and walked away without another word. But the embarrassment lingered. The receptionist wouldn't make eye contact. 2 women from the law firm across the hall whispered as he passed. He could practically feel the judgment like static in the air. That night, he didn't even bother turning on the TV. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the fine notice Karen had taped to his door. This one for inappropriate conduct in common areas. He poured himself a drink and studied it. The font choice alone was offensive. Comic Sans again with a gold clip art border. And the signature? Karen Nichols, President/Operations Authority. Operations Authority. He shook his head. You've got to be kidding me. He could complain to property management, but that company had all but vanished. The building's upkeep was already slipping. Half the lights flickered, the roof leaked when it rained, and rumor had it the owners were behind on taxes. Karen's authority wasn't real, but in a vacuum of leadership, nobody challenged her. Nobody wanted to get involved. And that's when Mark realized something simple but powerful. The only thing keeping Karen in power was everyone else's silence. The next morning, he stopped by Brian's office. You ever think about who actually owns this building? Brian shrugged. Some investment group in Texas, I think. They never answer emails. Yeah, Mark said. Figures. He started to ask around quietly how long leases ran, who paid what issues people had. Turns out everyone had stories. Repairs ignored, fees raised, and no accountability. Karen had taken advantage of the chaos and filled the vacuum with her own little empire. Over the next few days, he watched her more carefully. She'd show up early, park crookedly in a reserved spot, march into the lobby and hold board meetings with Denise, the self-appointed vice president who mainly nodded in agreement. They'd drink Starbucks and gossip loudly about problem tenants, which apparently meant anyone who had opinions. It was all theater. And Mark, sitting quietly in his office, started to think about how theater ends with a curtain call. Still, there was one more humiliation left in store. Late Friday afternoon, he came back from lunch to find a bright pink sticker slapped across his office door. Notice of lease review, pending termination. He peeled it off, reading the fine print that might as well have been written in crayon. It accused him of repeated misconduct and attitude incompatible with HOA harmony. Attitude. That was the word that did it. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift. Not anger exactly, more like amusement sharpened by resolve. She'd embarrassed him, sure, but she'd also revealed her weakness. People like Karen never stopped until they overplayed their hand. And she'd just done it. That night, sitting again on his porch with a beer and the whine of distant sprinklers, he laid out the facts in his head like a blueprint. The building was half empty. The owners were neglecting it. Karen's fake authority worked only because nobody else bothered to step up. Maybe it was time someone did. He smiled, a quiet, knowing grin spreading across his face. The kind of smile that comes right before a checkmate. She thinks she runs the place, he muttered. Let's see how she feels when I actually do. He leaned back, feeling the desert wind roll in, and for the first time since the whole mess began, he wasn't irritated. He was entertained, because this wasn't just an HOA war anymore. It was a lesson in irony waiting to be written. And Mark? He was more than ready to be the author. The next morning began with a new kind of energy. Not the irritation that came from another HOA notice, but something calmer, strategic. Mark woke up before sunrise, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at his kitchen table with his laptop. He wasn't searching for revenge in the way most people thought of it. He wanted balance, fairness, a return to quiet sanity. And if that meant turning Karen's own system against her, then so be it. He started with a simple search: Desert Trails Business Complex Property Ownership. Took him less than 5 minutes to find the listing. The building, it turned out, was in financial limbo, under a holding company based in Texas, with maintenance arrears and liability reassessment listed in public records. In plain English, it was struggling. He clicked deeper, cross-checking with county records, and there it was. The mortgage was in default, the management company inactive. He sat back and let out a low whistle. So that's how she got away with it. With no real owner in charge, Karen had swooped in and crowned herself queen. Nobody had questioned her because, technically, no one was minding the store. He sipped his coffee and chuckled softly. Well, looks like it's for sale. He wasn't rich, not by any stretch. But he wasn't naive either. Years of military service had taught him discipline. Years of consulting had taught him the value of partnerships. He picked up the phone and called an old friend, Eli, a retired colleague who'd moved into commercial real estate. Eli, he said, voice calm but laced with a hint of mischief. How hard would it be to buy an office complex that's half empty and mismanaged by a woman with a clipboard? There was a pause, then Eli laughed. Sounds like a sitcom waiting to happen. Send me the details. By noon, they were on a Zoom call, looking through the financials. Eli leaned forward, eyebrows raised. This is a steal. If we partner on it, lease income alone would cover the mortgage in 18 months. Mark smiled. Perfect. Let's keep this quiet. And just like that, the plan was born not out of spite but out of sheer poetic logic. For the next few weeks, Mark played the long game. He kept attending to his clients, kept responding to Karen's ridiculous emails with polite, one-line acknowledgments. Every time she'd swing her clipboard like a sword, he'd smile and nod, knowing that each outburst was just one more story to file away for later. One morning, she confronted him again, this time about his parking spot. Mr. Collins, she said, hands on hips. Your vehicle's front tire is resting beyond the designated line. He squinted at the pavement. The line she referred to was so faded it looked more like a ghost of paint than an actual boundary. You mean the tire touching the air where a line used to be? Rules are rules, she said, lips pursed. I'll be documenting this. Please do, he said evenly. I like to keep records, too. Her eyes narrowed, trying to read his tone. But there was nothing to read. He was serene, calm, a man at peace because the storm belonged to him now. Later that day, he met Eli in person at a small diner across town. They reviewed the purchase terms, financing, and the plan to close under an LLC. Mark insisted on privacy, no announcements, no visible ownership changes until the ink was dry. The irony was too delicious to ruin early. Once we buy it, Eli asked, stirring his coffee. What's the plan for her? Mark leaned back, a small smile forming. Nothing dramatic, just policy enforcement, the real kind. No shouting, no clipboards. She'll hang herself with her own rules. Eli laughed. You always did believe in poetic justice. By week 4, everything was in motion. The title transfer was scheduled. The bank approved financing. Mark's LLC, quietly named Ironwood Holdings, was listed as the buyer of record. Nobody in the building knew, not even the property maintenance team, who still answered to Karen's endless chain of emails. During that waiting period, Karen seemed to sense something shifting. She doubled down on her patrols. Tenants whispered that she'd started inspecting trash bins for unapproved waste. One afternoon, Mark found her measuring the distance between lobby chairs with a tape measure. He asked, You checking for earthquakes? She didn't even look up. Uniform spacing ensures a professional environment. He nodded slowly. Of course, we wouldn't want asymmetrical seating to threaten the economy. Her glare could have melted paint. When Friday rolled around, she struck again. This time, she taped another letter to his door. Notice of unapproved vehicle decal. The decal in question was a faded parking pass from a previous office complex that had been stuck to his windshield for months. Mark read the letter carefully, smiled, and folded it into his briefcase. He'd decided that would be the last one. That evening, he stopped by Eli's office. Everything signed? He asked. Eli handed him a single folder. Signed, sealed, recorded. As of noon today, you own Desert Trails. Mark stared at the folder for a moment, then let out a slow laugh. You know, I've never been fired from a building I own before. Congratulations, Eli said, clinking his coffee mug against Mark's. You're officially a landlord. The drive back felt different that night. He pulled into the same cracked parking lot he'd driven into for 3 years. But the view had changed. The building looked smaller somehow, stripped of its false authority. The flickering light above the entrance didn't annoy him anymore. It was his problem now, and oddly, that felt satisfying. He parked, perfectly within the faded lines for the record, and walked into the lobby. Karen was there, of course, tapping away on her phone while lecturing Denise about attendance logs. She barely noticed him at first. Mr. Collins, she called after a moment. Please remember to submit your lobby usage form next time you bring in outside guests. He nodded calmly. I'll make a note of that. He passed by the bulletin board where she'd posted a dozen of her infamous notices: quiet hours enforcement, dress code reminder, prohibited scents. He wondered what she'd do when all of those came down tomorrow morning. Because the next day, the sign crew would arrive, bright and early, to install new property signage. Under new ownership. The timing couldn't be more perfect. Karen had already sent him another warning email that morning about unauthorized use of air freshener. After catching a whiff of lavender in the hallway, the universe itself seemed to be setting the stage. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table again, papers spread out before him. Closing documents, receipts, tenant lists. He highlighted Karen's name on the lease records. Technically, she didn't have a legitimate lease at all. She'd claimed an administrative office under the HOA umbrella, but there was no legal record of payment, no rent, no approval, nothing. She was, in every practical sense, a squatter with a clipboard. He couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The woman who'd fired him for using the lobby was now occupying his building illegally. He leaned back, taking in the quiet of his home. Outside, the desert night was still. The sky shimmered faintly with heat waves rising off the pavement. It was peaceful again, the kind of peace he'd been missing since the day that first letter arrived. He thought about what tomorrow would look like. The crew rolling in with tools, the sound of a drill echoing through the lobby, the new sign going up. He could already imagine her voice. Outraged, disbelieving, probably calling someone to complain to. He smiled again, not out of spite but satisfaction. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to humiliate her. The truth would do that all by itself. Before heading to bed, he sent one email. Just one. To all tenants. Please note that Desert Trails Business Complex has undergone a recent ownership change. Tenants will receive updated contact information and lease terms soon. Thank you for your continued professionalism. He hit send and closed the laptop. It wasn't loud revenge. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, clean, and deeply satisfying. As he turned off the kitchen light, he glanced out the window toward the dark silhouette of the office building. For months, it had felt like a prison of pettiness. Tomorrow it would become something better, something his. He whispered to himself, "They have no idea what's coming." And with that, he went to sleep smiling, knowing the next sunrise wouldn't just bring another letter. It would bring a reckoning written in ink and ownership. The next morning broke with the sound of power drills echoing down the empty parking lot. Sunlight hit the glass doors just right, reflecting the shiny new metal letters being mounted above the entrance. Under new ownership. The workers moved fast, chatting as they worked, the rhythmic hum of the drill slicing through the desert quiet. It was poetic, one kind of noise replacing another. Mark stood just inside the lobby, coffee in hand, watching it all unfold. It was surreal seeing his plan come to life after weeks of playing it cool. For once, he didn't need to say a word. The truth was being nailed into the building one letter at a time. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the familiar sound of heels began echoing through the hall. Sharp, rapid, angry. Karen. She appeared from the side corridor, clipboard in hand like always, mouth already forming the start of a complaint. Her eyes darted from the ladder to the men drilling above the door. "Excuse me," she barked. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" The foreman looked down. "Installing the new signage, ma'am." "Signage?" she repeated. "Who approved that?" There was no HOA meeting. No design vote. No. Mark took a calm sip of coffee and said, "I did." She turned, and for a second her expression softened, as if she hadn't quite processed the words. "You did. That's right," he said, nodding toward the folder on the reception desk. "Building ownership documents. County records updated. You're looking at the new landlord." The silence that followed was cinematic. Her face went through the stages of confusion like a bad internet connection. Disbelief, processing, panic. Then came denial. "That's not possible," she said quickly, shaking her head. You can't just buy a building." "Apparently I can," he said evenly. "And did." Karen's jaw dropped. This must be some kind of fraud. I'll have to verify this with the management office. Mark smiled. You mean the one that hasn't existed for 2 years? Her hand gripped the clipboard tighter. I'm calling the HOA board. They'll have this reversed immediately. He shrugged. Go ahead. But while you're at it, you might want to check the bylaws about unauthorized use of office space and self-appointed leadership positions. Turns out, you've been occupying an unleased unit without proper documentation. That word, unauthorized, landed like a dart. She froze for half a beat, and he could see it sink in. I'm the operations manager, she sputtered. Not anymore, Mark said softly. As of today, you're an unapproved occupant in a privately owned facility. The workers finished mounting the last letter and stepped down, admiring their work. The bold words under new ownership gleamed above the door. It was like punctuation on a sentence he'd been writing for weeks. Karen's voice rose an octave. You can't do this. I'm calling the police. By all means, Mark said. Please do. She stormed off, high heels clacking like gunfire. The entire lobby went quiet. Tenants peeked out from office doors, half curious, half thrilled. Everyone had been waiting for something like this, even if they didn't know it. 20 minutes later, the police arrived, 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They found Karen pacing outside by the parking lot, shouting into her phone. This man is illegally trying to evict me from my position, she said dramatically, pointing toward the building. He's staging a coup. The taller officer, a young man with mirrored sunglasses, blinked. A coup? Yes, she snapped. He forged documents and took control of the HOA. Mark walked up calmly, holding his folder. Officers, I can explain everything. I'm the new property owner. Purchased last week through county channels. Here's the deed. He handed them the papers, crisp and official, complete with stamps. They skimmed the documents while Karen tried to peer over their shoulders. This isn't real, she shouted. He's making it up. The officer looked at her, then back at Mark. It's very real, ma'am. His name's on the deed. Karen's face flushed. That doesn't matter. I run this building. I've been managing it for years. Without a lease or written authorization, Mark asked gently. That did it. The officers exchanged a look. One of them sighed. Ma'am, if you're not a tenant of record, you'll need to vacate if the property owner asks. I am a tenant of record, she protested. The HOA office pays the lease. Would you happen to have proof of payment? Her mouth opened and closed. Well, I handle it internally. Internally where? In my office. Mark folded his arms. Which is technically my office now. The officers stifled grins. One finally said, All right, ma'am, let's keep this civil. Maybe you two can talk this out privately? Oh, I'd love that, Mark said, motioning toward the door. Karen, why don't we step inside? She followed reluctantly, muttering something about lawsuits and harassment of officials. Inside, tenants had gathered discreetly, pretending to check their mail or sip coffee but clearly watching the showdown. Here's the situation, Mark said, setting the deed on the reception desk. You've been acting as an HOA president in a commercial property that no longer recognizes your authority. You've collected dues from tenants, issued fines without legal basis, and occupied an unleased unit. I'm not here to humiliate you, Karen. I just need you to vacate the space by end of week. Her face went pale. You can't evict the HOA. There is no HOA, he said quietly. The corporation that ran it dissolved 3 years ago. I checked the records. The air seemed to drain from her lungs. For the first time since he'd met her, Karen looked small. Not defeated, just disoriented. She leaned against the desk, blinking fast. You're lying, she whispered. He shook his head. I'm not, but you're welcome to verify it. That's when she snapped. This is harassment. You're destroying community order. I'm not leaving. The yelling drew the officers back in. They exchanged looks again, clearly done with the drama. Ma'am, we're going to need you to calm down, one said. Karen jabbed a finger toward Mark. He's a fraud. Mark handed the officer another sheet, printouts of her HOA fines and payment requests, each linked to a personal PayPal account. You might want to take a look at those. The younger officer raised his eyebrows. Ma'am, these payments, did they go through your personal account? Karen's eyes darted. That's standard procedure. Not in Arizona, the officer said, and definitely not for an HOA that doesn't legally exist. Her expression twisted into panic. You don't understand. I was maintaining order. They spoke quietly to her for a few minutes, voices low and patient. She kept insisting she was in charge, that she had authority, that she was protecting the tenants. But when the officer asked for documentation again, all she could offer was her clipboard filled with self-signed bylaws. Mark just stood nearby, sipping his coffee, saying nothing. Finally, one of the officers stepped back inside. Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to come with us for questioning. There's evidence here of financial misconduct. The color drained completely from her face. What? It's not an arrest yet, he added. But we do need to clarify some things. She stared at him, stunned. You can't do this to me. I run this place. Not anymore, Mark said softly. As they led her outside, clipboard still in hand, tenants peeked from behind their doors. The dentist mouthed, "Oh my God." The accountant took a discreet photo. Someone even clapped once before stopping. Mark didn't gloat. He just turned back to the front desk, gathered the scattered HOA notices, and dropped them into the recycling bin. And right there, as the police car rolled out of the lot, he delivered the one moment of audience engagement he'd been holding back. At this point, he said quietly, almost as if speaking directly to the listener, I've got to ask, have you ever dealt with an HOA like this? Drop your story in the comments, hit subscribe if you love poetic justice, and let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. Then he set down his coffee, looked out the window and added, Now, where were we? The rest of the day passed like a collective exhale. Tenants came by to thank him, some sheepishly, others openly relieved. The janitor smiled and said, Guess the queen lost her crown, huh? Mark chuckled. She did. But don't worry, I don't need one. Outside, the sun glinted off the new metal letters. The building, for the first time in years, felt light. He'd expected to feel triumphant, maybe even smug, but instead he just felt satisfied, balanced, as if the world had quietly corrected itself without the need for shouting or spectacle. When the last car left and the parking lot went still, he stood alone by the window, watching the sprinklers switch on, misting the dry air. The building hummed softly around him, calm, alive. He smiled. Somewhere, in some holding cell or police office, Karen was probably trying to file a complaint about the paint color. He poured himself another cup of coffee and whispered, Now that's what I call compliance. The following week felt like a long exhale after a storm that had lasted far too long. The tension that had haunted the building, the whispered conversations, the sideways glances, the nervous laughter whenever Karen appeared, was gone. In its place came something rare for a suburban office complex. Peace. The kind that didn't need a memo or a meeting to explain itself. It just existed like air after rain. Mark arrived early Monday morning to find the lobby unrecognizable, not because it had changed, but because it finally felt like it belonged to the people who used it. Someone had brought donuts. The vending machine, which had been broken for months, now worked again. The fake plant Karen insisted was aesthetic was gone, replaced by a real fern that actually looked alive. And taped to the bulletin board, where her endless printed violations used to hang, was a handwritten note that read, Thank you, Mark. Coffee's on us. He chuckled quietly and poured himself a cup from the new machine he'd ordered. One that brewed actual coffee, not the scorched blend that tasted like melted plastic. He took a slow sip and let it sink in. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about reclaiming something simple, decency, calm, normalcy. Throughout the morning, tenants dropped by one. Brian, the nervous accountant, showed up first. So, he said, rubbing the back of his neck, we can use the lobby again, right? No fines? No clipboard patrols. Mark grinned. Brian, you can host a full-on parade in there if you want. Just don't spill anything on the rug. The dentist popped his head in next. I put my sign back up, he said, pointing proudly toward the hallway. In Comic Sans. Just for her. Mark nearly spit out his coffee laughing. You're a brave man. Word spread fast. The tension that had once ruled the halls turned into a kind of running joke. People laughed again. They greeted each other in the lobby. The place felt like a community instead of a hostage situation. And for all the joy and quiet humor floating through the building, Mark stayed grounded. He didn't want to become what he'd replaced. Power, he'd learned long ago, could corrupt even the smallest spaces. So instead of speeches or grand announcements, he let his actions do the talking. First, he sent out a simple email. Dear tenants, the Desert Trails complex is now under new management. All prior HOA regulations are void. The only rules going forward are common sense. Respect the space, respect each other, and pay rent on time. We'll handle maintenance promptly and transparently. Suggestions welcome. The replies poured in. Dozens of thank yous. A few jokes. Even one tenant offering to paint the faded parking lines himself. It felt like the soul of the building had been restored, not by force, but by removing the noise that had smothered it. Midweek, a letter arrived in the mailroom addressed to property owner. The return address made him laugh out loud. Nichols Legal Defense Associates. He didn't even need to open it to guess what was inside. A mix of accusations, empty threats, and maybe a demand for reinstatement. He placed it on his desk, considered it for a long moment, then stuck a yellow post-it on the front. It read simply, Return to sender non-compliant postage alignment. He dropped it in the outgoing mail tray and smiled. It wasn't petty. It was poetic. The next day, the mailman delivered 3 more letters, all from Karen's lawyer. He returned those too. By the end of the week, it became a running joke among tenants. The receptionist started a small whiteboard tally behind the counter labeled Karen Mail. 5, then 6, then 8. Life for once was funny again. On Thursday, Mark hosted an informal tenant meeting in the lobby, the first real one the building had ever seen. No clipboards, no bylaws, just folding chairs and good coffee. People showed up carrying snacks, stories, and laughter. So, Brian said, standing awkwardly, what's the new policy on lawn ornaments? Everyone laughed. Mark raised his cup. Policy is simple. If it doesn't scream, bite, or block the fire exit, it's fine. Someone clapped. Someone else shouted, finally, a rule we can understand. Then the dentist raised a hand. What about the HOA? Mark's smile turned softer. There isn't one anymore. The HOA didn't own this place. It pretended to. Karen took advantage of that. But we're not doing that again. If something breaks, you call me. If something's unfair, we talk. If someone tries to start a new committee, he paused for effect. We burn the paperwork before it spreads. The laughter that followed was warm, genuine. The sound of a shared relief. Later that afternoon, as everyone went back to work, Mark took a quiet walk through the halls. He passed each door slowly, remembering how strange it had once felt to dread walking these same floors. He paused by the office Karen had claimed. Empty now, desk cleared, walls bare except for a single nail where her leadership award certificate used to hang. He didn't feel hatred. If anything, he felt pity. There was something tragic about people who needed control so badly they forgot how to live without it. Karen had treated authority like oxygen. Now she was gasping for air somewhere else, and all she'd left behind was a story. And what a story it was. That evening, as the desert sky dimmed and the hum of sprinklers filled the air again, Mark sat in the lobby under the new sign. It gleamed faintly in the dying light, under new ownership. It wasn't just about owning a building. It was about owning peace, finally, after months of chaos disguised as order. A tenant walked by and handed him a coffee mug. It had bold letters on the side that read, "You're fired." He laughed so hard he almost spilled it. "Let me guess," he said. "Gift shop special?" The tenant grinned. "Custom order." We all chipped in. He turned the mug around. On the back it said, "From management, the real kind." That night he stayed late, catching up on paperwork while the building slept. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. Every so often, he'd glance up at the empty hallway and feel that same deep sense of satisfaction. Not triumph, not revenge, just balance restored. He thought about the lessons tucked inside the chaos. That sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting back. It's succeeding quietly in plain sight. It's watching arrogance collapse under the weight of its own nonsense. He thought, too, about what he'd tell others if they asked for advice on dealing with someone like Karen. He'd say, "Don't fight crazy with crazy. Fight it with calm. Paper beats ego every time." Before leaving, he wrote one more note on the bulletin board. Not a rule, not a regulation, just a message. Good fences don't make good neighbors. Good humor does. He pinned it beside the old coffee machine sticker, the one that read, "Out of order." A small reminder of how far they'd come. As he locked the doors and stepped outside, the night air hit him with that warm desert stillness. The parking lot was empty except for his car and the reflection of the new sign glowing faintly against the glass. He paused, turned back once more, and smiled. "Fired by the Queen," he said to himself. "Now her landlord. Can't write irony better than that." He drove off slowly, the kind of drive where you roll the windows down just to feel the wind and let the quiet hum of satisfaction do all the talking. Back home, as he poured himself a nightcap, he realized something funny. He hadn't received a single email in days. No violations, no notices, no nonsense. Just peace. He sat back, took a sip, and chuckled. Somewhere, maybe in another HOA, another building, another unsuspecting suburb, Karen was probably taping a new list of rules for harmony on a bulletin board. Someone else would learn soon enough. But here, in Desert Trails, everything was calm again. No clipboards, no fines. Just neighbors who finally remembered they were supposed to get along. And as Mark turned off the lights and looked out his window at the faint glow of his building in the distance, he couldn't help but whisper the line that summed it all up, half prayer, half punchline. "Justice served, extra smooth, just like my coffee." A few months passed, and life at Desert Trails settled into something that finally resembled normal. Not the stiff, rule-ridden version of normal that Karen had tried to enforce, but the quiet, real kind, where people laughed in the hallways again, where the vending machine actually worked, and where nobody measured how far your chair sat from the wall. The air itself felt lighter, freer. Even the sprinklers seemed to hiss with a little more rhythm, like they too were relieved to be free of oversight. Mark had turned 58 that spring. He was still in the office most mornings by 7, still the first one to brew coffee, still the last one to lock up. But now, instead of doing it out of habit, he did it out of pride. There was something deeply satisfying about walking into that same beige building every morning, the one that used to make him grind his teeth, and knowing it now ran on respect instead of fear. He changed a few things, nothing flashy. The new benches outside had cushions instead of splintered wood. The plants in the lobby were real, watered weekly. The bulletin board had been transformed from Karen's kingdom of laminated threats into a cheerful patchwork of community notes. A flyer for Brian's tax seminar. A notice about the dentist's free clinic. A kid's drawing taped up with the caption, "My dad works here." Mark looked at it often, and every time he smiled. He never mentioned Karen's name again. Not out of avoidance, but because she didn't matter anymore. She'd become a story people chuckled about over lunch, a lesson told half-seriously to newcomers. "Watch out," the janitor would say, grinning. "If you put up too many signs, you might summon her ghost." It was late one afternoon in June when Mark found himself sitting in the same lobby chair where she'd once fired him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He leaned back, watching sunlight drift through the big glass doors, painting golden streaks across the tile. Somewhere down the hall, someone was playing country music low enough to be background noise. The hum of conversation, the occasional laugh, it all sounded like peace. He thought about how it had all started. Just one ridiculous letter, one act of pettiness that spiraled into something bigger. And yet, out of that nonsense had come something worthwhile. It reminded him of one of his favorite sayings from his military days. Never waste a bad situation. There's always something to build out of it. He'd built something here, even if it wasn't intentional at first. Not just ownership of a building, but a community that ran on humor instead of fear. It made him think about how people, especially those his age, valued that sense of control. Not the loud kind that bosses others around, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing your world is finally in order. Later that week, he got a letter, an actual handwritten one, something rare enough these days to make him pause. The return address read, Mesa County Correctional Facility. He almost laughed. Almost. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note, written in precise, tidy handwriting. To whom it may concern, I hope you're happy. You humiliated me. You destroyed my reputation. I was only trying to create order. People need structure, and you made a mockery of that. You'll see. Communities don't last without rules. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. Mark folded it neatly and set it aside. He didn't feel anger. He didn't even feel satisfaction. Just a faint sadness, like seeing someone who'd learned all the wrong lessons. He wrote a brief response on a sticky note, stuck it to the letter, and dropped it in his desk drawer. It read, Rules without reason make order without peace. He didn't send it. Some lessons couldn't be taught by mail. The next day, the tenants surprised him. Apparently, someone had organized a small barbecue in the parking lot. Nothing fancy, just folding tables, paper plates, and the smell of burgers grilling under the desert sun. Someone had hung a little banner that read, 1 year of sanity celebration. He walked outside to find half the tenants there already, laughing, chatting, swapping stories. Brian waved him over. We figured we owed you one, he said. For what? For saving us from clipboard tyranny, the dentist said, flipping a burger. And for teaching us that peace and coffee solve more problems than committees ever could. Mark chuckled. I'll drink to that. They ate, joked, and swapped stories about the old days, when every sneeze might earn a fine and every parking job was an act of rebellion. The laughter was contagious. Even the new tenants, people who'd never met Karen, joined in, sensing the shared history that tied everyone together. At one point, someone asked, Do you ever regret buying this place? All the stress. Mark looked around. The setting sun painted the parking lot gold. The sign above the door glowed softly, under new ownership. He thought about everything that had happened, every absurd moment, every letter, every eye roll, every laugh. Not for a second, he said. It's the best decision I ever made. There was a pause, a warm one, filled with the hum of conversation and the smell of barbecue sauce. Then Brian raised his soda can. To Mark, the only man in history who got fired from a building and came back as the boss. Everyone laughed and cheered. Mark lifted his cup. To peace, and to remembering that power is just borrowed, but decency lasts longer. It was the kind of line that stayed with people. That night, long after the chairs had been folded and the lot gone quiet, he walked the property one last time. The air was warm, the kind of summer night that hummed with distant crickets and smelled faintly of rain that never came. He looked up at the building, beige, simple, familiar, and smiled. The lights inside glowed like tiny promises. One in the accountant's office, another in the dentist's room, and a third in the janitor's closet, where the radio still played old country songs. It wasn't fancy, but it was alive. He walked to the lobby, turned off the last light, and lingered at the door. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice again. Sharp, bossy, echoing down the hall. You can't do that, he smiled. I already did. The next morning, as always, he arrived early. But this time, instead of going straight to his office, he sat out front on the new bench. The sun crept up over the horizon, hitting the sign just right, turning the letters into gold. A neighbor from the next complex waved. He waved back. A moment later, the mail truck pulled up. The mailman, a cheerful guy with sunburned cheeks, handed him a small envelope. Looks like another one for you, boss. Mark opened it. Inside was a simple card from one of the tenants. Thanks for making this place feel like home. He sat there for a long while, the card in his hand, the desert morning stretching wide and quiet around him. That's when it struck him. This wasn't just about an HOA story anymore. It was about something deeper, about how small moments of absurdity could lead to clarity, how standing up calmly could matter more than shouting back, and how sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was restoration. He thought about how life had changed. The petty was gone, replaced by purpose. The laughter that used to come in nervous bursts now flowed easily. People respected him not because of ownership papers or power, but because he'd reminded them what fairness looked like. He took another slow sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. He thought about all the people out there, folks dealing with their own Karens, their own tiny dictators, their own absurd fights over mailboxes and fences. He hoped they'd find their own quiet revenge, their own way to flip the script without losing their calm. He set the cup down, smiled toward the horizon, and said softly, "So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it." Then he stood up, brushed off his jeans, and walked back inside, ready to start another ordinary, peaceful day in the building he'd once been fired from. And as the automatic door closed behind him, the faint hum of the coffee machine started up again. Steady, rhythmic, and perfectly in tune with the quiet life he'd built from one ridiculous letter. That was the thing about revenge done right. It didn't end in shouting. It ended in silence, the good kind, the kind that sounds like peace.